What happens when the hidden desires of a suburban wife lead to a deadly confrontation? What secrets were harbored behind closed doors that pushed an ordinary housewife to the brink? In the quaint suburb of Churchill, cobblestone streets wind through a mix of Victorian and colonial homes, their overgrown hedges and wild gardens adding to the town's old-world charm. The bustling town square, framed by a historic bakery and cozy bookstore, exudes an inviting atmosphere with the scent of fresh bread and old books. At its center, a weathered fountain and the imposing Gothic church with stained glass windows stand as symbols of the town's rich history and community spirit. Surrounding cottages, draped in ivy, reflect Churchill's deep-rooted sense of tradition and continuity. However, beneath this idyllic exterior lay a hidden narrative of deception and betrayal. This is the harrowing tale of Susan Morgan, whose life spiraled into a tragic ending, forever altering the lives of those around her. Susan Morgan, a 42-year-old mother of two, epitomized the ideal suburban wife in the charming town of Churchill. With her husband, Robert Morgan, she had carefully crafted a life that appeared enviable to anyone looking in from the outside. Robert, a successful architect, enjoyed a thriving career that supported their comfortable lifestyle. Their home, a Victorian marvel, was the model of suburban perfection, adorned with elegant furnishings and meticulously curated decor. Susan's background was rich with artistic influence. Though she had initially studied art history and worked briefly as a gallery assistant, family responsibilities took precedence over her career. Her role evolved into managing the household and raising their two children, Emily and Daniel. Her artistic sensibilities continued to shape their home, transforming it into a warm, inviting space. Despite her apparent success, Susan felt a growing sense of dissatisfaction as her life seemed to revolve around routines and unmet aspirations. Robert Morgan, at 45, was a prominent architect known for his innovative designs that seamlessly blended modern and historical elements. His demanding career, however, often consumed his time, leaving him less available for family life. His reserved and meticulous nature, while appreciated in his professional realm, created a growing distance between him and Susan. Their marriage, once filled with the promise of shared dreams, had begun to show signs of strain. Their children, Emily, 14, and Daniel, 10, were bright and well-behaved. Emily, with her artistic talent, mirrored her mother's creative streak, while Daniel's lively personality and interest in sports kept the household dynamic and engaging. Yet, despite their outward success and the well-maintained facade of their lives, there was a simmering undercurrent of discontent. James Reynolds, a newcomer to Churchill, was a 40-year-old journalist with a mysterious past. His arrival had introduced a fresh, intriguing element into the otherwise predictable rhythms of Susan's life. Although they had exchanged casual pleasantries when James was initially getting to know his neighbors, their interaction had been minimal and polite. The turning point came on an ordinary afternoon at the local store. Susan and James happened to cross paths while shopping. James, ever the gentleman, offered Susan a lift back to her home, a gesture that seemed innocent enough. Susan accepted the offer, seeing it as a friendly act of neighborly kindness. However, what began as a simple lift home soon spiraled into a tragic affair. James, who had concealed darker aspects of his nature, harbored intentions far removed from those of a cordial neighbor. The seemingly mundane act of providing a ride became a deadly encounter that would forever alter Susan's life and the lives of those around her. After that day when James Reynolds offered Susan Morgan a lift home, their interactions evolved into a more open and friendly exchange. Although their time together was limited, every moment spent with James felt immensely significant to Susan. To her, these interactions were a welcome distraction from her loneliness, an opportunity to converse with someone who seemed genuinely interested in her. Susan found herself drawn to James's easy charm and engaging conversation, which contrasted sharply with her routine life at home. Susan would occasionally visit James at his house while the children were at school, or he would come over when the kids were around and she was busy with household chores. Their meetings were typically brief, but each encounter felt like a precious escape from the monotony of her daily life. Susan relished these moments as they provided a much-needed respite from her isolation and gave her a sense of excitement she had long been missing. However, for James, these interactions had a far deeper impact. From the moment he had offered Susan a lift, his feelings had begun to shift from casual acquaintance to something far more intense. James became increasingly infatuated with Susan. His affection quickly evolved into an obsession, a consuming desire that he struggled to control. His thoughts were dominated by fantasies of being with her, longing to hold her in his arms and make her his own. This fixation grew more intense with each passing day, driving James to become more involved and assertive in their interactions. James's obsession was not immediately apparent to Susan, who continued to view their time together as a harmless, albeit thrilling, diversion. She was unaware of the extent of James's feelings and the dangerous path their relationship was heading towards. For Susan, the affair was more about escaping her own feelings of loneliness and dissatisfaction rather than a deep-seated romantic entanglement. During the times when Robert, her husband, was around, he remained oblivious to the growing connection between Susan and James. Robert, often preoccupied with his architectural projects and frequent travels, trusted James to look after his family during his absences. On several occasions, Robert asked James to check in on Susan and the kids while he was away, unknowingly providing James with more opportunities to deepen his involvement with Susan. This seemingly innocent request from Robert, intended to ensure the well-being of his family, unintentionally facilitated the burgeoning affair between Susan and James. As Susan and James's relationship continued, the strain of balancing her double life began to take its toll. Susan struggled with mounting feelings of guilt and the ever-present fear of discovery. The thrill of their secret meetings was tempered by the anxiety of potentially being caught. Despite her attempts to maintain a semblance of normalcy at home, the pressure of her hidden affair with James grew increasingly difficult to manage. James, driven by his obsession, began to exert more influence over Susan, pushing for more time together and becoming more demanding. The risks associated with their affair became more apparent, and Susan found it increasingly challenging to keep up the facade she had constructed. Her interactions with James became more frequent and intense, heightening the danger of exposure. Susan Morgan had noticed a subtle shift in James Reynolds' behavior. She chose to dismiss it as part of a friendly, neighborly relationship. Despite her initial reservations, Susan continued to spend time with James. Their interactions, though infrequent, were filled with a sense of intimacy and connection that Susan had not felt in years. She would visit James's home or have him over while her children were at school. The moments they shared, while brief, were charged with a potent mix of longing and distraction, providing Susan with a temporary escape from the monotony of her suburban life. However, the nature of their interactions began to evolve. What had started as innocent exchanges gradually took on a more intense and demanding tone. Susan, feeling increasingly isolated, found herself drawn to the attention and affection that James offered. His presence, though unsettling at times, made her feel valued and desired, contrasting sharply with the growing distance she felt in her marriage. One fateful afternoon, when Susan was alone in the house, the atmosphere between her and James became charged with an undeniable tension. James, having taken advantage of the opportunity to visit Susan while her children were at school, found her in a state of lingering vulnerability. His desire for her had been building, and upon seeing Susan in a state of casual repose, his longing turned into an all-consuming obsession. He was unable to restrain himself, driven by a need that had intensified over time. Susan, sensing the dangerous turn of events, was overwhelmed with fear and urgency. She tried to assert her boundaries, knowing that the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. Despite her pleas for James to leave, he was relentless. His desire for Susan, coupled with his manipulative justifications, made it nearly impossible for him to retreat. He moved closer, his actions fueled by a combination of unchecked passion and a sense of betrayal towards Susan's husband, Robert. Susan, caught in a maelstrom of conflicting emotions, felt paralyzed. The intense pressure of James's advances left her feeling suffocated and unable to act decisively. Her yearning for affection, coupled with the fear of confrontation, made it difficult for her to reject James's advances outright. She felt trapped between her desire for connection and the growing realization of the perilous situation she was in. Just as the situation reached a critical point, The sound of her children's voices echoed through the house. Their arrival, filled with the innocence and excitement of youth, provided a sudden and jarring contrast to the charged atmosphere. Susan's sense of relief was palpable as the presence of her children offered her a moment of reprieve and a chance to regain her composure. At that very moment, Robert returned home earlier than expected, having come to pick up the children from school. He entered the house and was immediately struck by the sight before him. The scene was both unexpected and shocking. Susan and James, caught in a compromising and intimate posture, appeared disoriented and caught off guard. The visual impact of the scene was stark, contrasting sharply with the normalcy Robert had anticipated. Robert stood silently, his presence a heavy weight in the room. The sight of Susan and James in such a state triggered a torrent of thoughts and questions in his mind. His initial reaction was one of stunned silence, the shock of the moment leaving him unable to articulate his feelings. Susan's attempts to explain the situation in the aftermath of the confrontation were insufficient in alleviating Robert's doubts and suspicions. The visual evidence of the encounter had left an indelible mark, casting a shadow over any subsequent explanations. James, realizing the gravity of the situation and the futility of further attempts to pursue his desires, chose to leave. His departure was marked by a profound sense of disappointment and frustration. The close brush with achieving his goals, only to be thwarted by the sudden and unavoidable intervention of reality, left him feeling defeated. Weeks passed, and the once frequent interactions between Susan and James dwindled into nothing more than casual greetings exchanged from a distance. Their once secretive and intense relationship now reduced to mere waves and polite nods. To the outside world, it seemed as though nothing had changed, but inside, a storm was brewing, particularly in Robert's mind. The image of that day when he walked in on Susan and James in a compromising situation lingered, playing over and over in his thoughts. Each time Robert looked at his wife, suspicion and doubt gnawed at him, eating away at the trust they had once shared. Unable to shake the feeling that something more was going on, Robert grew increasingly vigilant. He began to monitor his wife's every move, scrutinizing her interactions and behavior. It wasn't long before his unease drove him to take more drastic measures. In a bid to uncover the truth, Robert secretly installed an audio recorder and a hidden camera in their home. He wanted to catch any possible interactions between Susan and James, to hear the conversations they might have when he wasn't around. The thought of betrayal consumed him, and he needed to know if his fears were justified. Months passed with no incident, and the recordings revealed nothing out of the ordinary. Susan seemed to have distanced herself from James, and their lives fell back into a routine of normalcy, or so it seemed. But the tension within Robert only grew, festering beneath the surface. He was waiting for the moment when his worst fears would be confirmed, though he hoped that day would never come. Then, one morning, as Robert prepared to leave for the office, the stage was set for the unraveling of everything. Susan, as was her usual practice, walked him to the car, kissing him goodbye and waving as he drove off. James, who had been watching from a distance, saw his opportunity. The moment Robert's car disappeared down the street, James quickly dressed and made his way over to Susan's house. His obsession had reached a fever pitch, and he could no longer contain his desire to be with her. The memory of their previous encounters haunted him, driving him to take advantage of this moment when he knew Robert wouldn't be around. When James arrived at the house, he found Susan relaxing on the couch, a bowl of fruit by her side, and a small pocket knife in her hand, which she had been using to peel the fruit. Susan was startled by James's sudden appearance and immediately felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. She hadn't expected him, and something about his demeanor set her on edge. Nevertheless, she greeted him, trying to hide her unease. James, driven by his longing and obsession, ignored the tension in the air. After a few minutes of awkward conversation, he moved from his seat and sat down right next to Susan on the couch. She felt the weight of his presence, his intentions clear. Her discomfort grew, and she asked him to move back to his original seat, or she would relocate herself. But James, blinded by his obsession, refused to heed her request. He leaned in closer with a sense of entitlement, insisting that Susan wanted the same thing he did. His advances became more forceful, and as he grabbed her, Susan's fear and disgust escalated. She pleaded with him to stop, but her words fell on deaf ears. James had lost all sense of reason, his obsession overriding any consideration for her boundaries. In a desperate attempt to protect herself, Susan managed to break free from his grasp, but James was relentless. He advanced towards her again, undeterred by her resistance. In a moment of sheer panic, Susan held up the small knife she had been using to peel fruit and threatened James with it, warning him to stay away. But James, driven by lust and convinced that she wouldn't actually harm him, dismissed her threat as a bluff. He rushed at her, intent on getting what he wanted. In an act of self-defense, Susan stabbed James with the knife, her movements fueled by fear and desperation. She struck him multiple times, each thrust a frantic attempt to stop his assault. The final blow came as she slashed his neck, cutting deep and severing the life from his body. James collapsed to the floor, blood pooling around him as he took his final breath. Susan stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. The knife slipped from her hand, clattering to the floor as she stared in horror at the lifeless body of the man who had once been her friend. She was paralyzed by shock and fear, knowing that her life had just taken a dark and irreversible turn. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Susan knew she needed help. Her first instinct was to call Robert. Her voice trembled as she begged him to come home, the urgency in her tone unmistakable. Robert, who had only just left for the office, sensed that something was terribly wrong. He turned his car around and sped back home, his heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anxiety. When Robert arrived, he was greeted by a scene of horror. The sight of James's bloodied body on the floor and the look of sheer terror on Susan's face told him everything he needed to know. The doubts and suspicions that had plagued him for months suddenly seemed trivial in the face of the reality before him. In the immediate aftermath of the horrifying incident, Robert was consumed by shock and confusion. He stood in the living room, staring at the lifeless body of James sprawled on the floor, blood seeping into the carpet. Susan, trembling and pale, tried to explain what had happened, her voice shaky and filled with desperation. But Robert could barely hear her over the sound of his own thoughts. His mind raced, replaying the scene he had just walked into and grappling with the overwhelming possibility that his worst suspicions had come true. Robert's gaze shifted from the blood-stained knife on the floor to his wife, who was pleading with him to believe her, to understand that she had acted in self-defense. But every word she spoke seemed hollow to him, like a poorly rehearsed excuse. The image of Susan and James standing too close together on that fateful day he had walked in on them flashed in his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to their relationship than Susan was admitting. To him, this was not just a tragic accident. It was the culmination of a secret affair that Susan was now trying to cover up. As Susan tried to explain, Robert's anger and sense of betrayal only grew. He saw her tears, her fear, but he couldn't separate those emotions from the suspicion that had taken root in his heart. In his eyes, her explanation was nothing more than a web of lies designed to protect herself, and rather than risk being implicated in what he believed was a premeditated murder, Robert made a cold, calculated decision. He reached for his phone and called the police, reporting that his wife had just killed a man in their home. Susan's eyes widened in disbelief as she watched her husband, the man she had loved and trusted, turn away from her and towards the police. She tried to protest, to make him see reason, but Robert's expression was hard, unforgiving. He stood by as the police arrived, his heart heavy with a mixture of anger and sadness. As they placed handcuffs on Susan and led her out of the house, Robert felt a grim satisfaction, convinced that he was doing the right thing. In his mind, Susan had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and she deserved to face the consequences of her actions. But as the days passed, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Robert found himself plagued by doubt. The initial satisfaction he had felt after turning Susan over to the authorities began to erode, replaced by a gnawing sense of unease. He replayed the events of that day over and over in his mind, questioning whether he had been too hasty, too quick to assume the worst. Despite his suspicions, he couldn't shake the memory of Susan's fear, her desperation as she tried to explain herself to him. As the investigation into James's death got underway, Robert tried to carry on with his life, but the guilt gnawed at him. He found himself unable to concentrate at work, his thoughts constantly drifting back to Susan and the mess their lives had become. Then, one day, as he was tidying up the house, Robert remembered the audio recorder and camera he had installed in the living room. His heart skipped a beat as he realized that he might have the very evidence that could clear Susan's name. or confirm his worst fears. With trembling hands, Robert retrieved the devices and played back the footage from the day of the incident. As the video played, he watched with mounting dread as the events unfolded before his eyes. He saw James enter the house, saw the tension in Susan's posture as he approached her. He watched as James tried to force himself on Susan, ignoring her pleas for him to stop. The audio captured every word, every struggle, every cry for help that Susan had uttered. And then he saw it. The moment when Susan, in a desperate bid to protect herself, grabbed the knife and struck James. As the video ended, Robert sat in stunned silence, the weight of what he had just seen pressing down on him. He had been wrong, terribly, unforgivably wrong. Susan had not killed James out of some twisted desire to cover up an affair. She had acted in self-defense, fighting off a man who had tried to violate her in her own home. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and for the first time since the incident, Robert felt the full force of his guilt. He had betrayed his wife, the woman who had done nothing but protect herself, and now she was facing the consequences of his mistrust. Determined to make things right, Robert immediately took the footage to the police, hoping it would be enough to prove Susan's innocence. But the damage had already been done. Susan had been charged with James's murder, and the trial was looming. As the days led up to the court date, Robert could hardly eat or sleep, consumed by the knowledge that his lack of trust had put his wife in this position. On the day of the trial, Susan recounted the events of that fateful day in meticulous detail. She described how James had come into her home uninvited, how he had tried to assault her, and how she had fought back in self-defense. Robert, racked with guilt, took the stand as well, explaining how his own insecurities and suspicions had led him to install the recording devices, and how they had ultimately proven that Susan was telling the truth. The courtroom was silent as the judge reviewed the evidence, including the footage that Robert had provided. When the judge finally spoke, she acknowledged that Susan had indeed acted in self-defense. However, the fact remained that a life had been lost, and the law required that justice be served. Susan was sentenced to a reduced term in prison, taking into account the circumstances of the case, but it did little to ease the crushing despair that weighed on her heart. As the verdict was read, Susan broke down in tears, the reality of her situation crashing over her like a wave. Her entire life had been torn apart in a matter of moments, and now she was being led away to serve time for a crime she had committed out of fear and desperation. Robert, standing in the courtroom, felt the full weight of his actions settle on his shoulders. He had failed his wife, betrayed her in the most profound way, and now he would have to live with the consequences of that betrayal. Life for Robert was never the same after that day. The home that had once been filled with warmth and love was now a cold, empty place, haunted by memories of what had happened. He was left to care for their children alone, each day a painful reminder of the trust he had shattered and the family he had lost. As the years passed, Robert's guilt only deepened, knowing that Susan was paying the price for his lack of faith in her. For Susan, the days in prison were long and filled with regret. She replayed the events that had led her to this point, cursing the dangerous relationship she had allowed to develop with James. Each day was a reminder of the life she had lost, the family she had been torn away from, all because of a man's obsession and her husband's inability to trust her. As time passed, both Susan and Robert were forced to come to terms with the choices they had made and the impact those choices had on their lives. Though they were physically separated, the bond they had once shared was now bound by a mutual sense of regret and sorrow. In the end, they were both victims of a tragic series of events that had shattered their lives, leaving them to pick up the pieces as best they could. Want to see more like this? Then click on the video you are seeing on your screen now.